Britain, we are still in what you could call the phony wall. There are already terrible cuts at local level, but in the main, the cuts haven't yet been announced. They're not, then people don't even know the detail, never mind feeling them in their own pockets. That's going to come a little bit later. But as that is announced, then the mood is going to change. There will be people who at the moment really imagine that if they keep their heads down and don't make too much of a fuss, they can get away without the cuts affecting them, and it will be some other people, scrounging people on benefits, or somebody else who is going to be affected. But once it's actually them, then there will be the possibility to bring Southern Europe to Britain. And for those of you who followed what's taken place in the countries of Southern Europe, they faced similar cuts to what we are now facing, but they're further ahead, they started earlier. And in Greece, for example, there have been 6 24-hour general strikes so far this year in response to the cuts that they are facing. In Spain, we've seen just last week, and there were people here who took part in that, so they should come into the discussion, but we saw in Spain just last week a massive general strike, with virtually the whole of the workforce refusing to go into work. 10 million people on the streets against the cuts that are taking place there. And here as well, we have the potential for a similar scale of movement. But at the moment, because it's not real yet, then the government propaganda has some effect. The kind of line, Tina, there is no alternative. You have to accept the cuts. There's nothing that can be done about it. It's a national tragedy. We're very sorry, but we've just got no choice but to carry it out for the good of the economy. That kind of propaganda in this early stage of the campaign is having a certain effect. And at the same time, they're getting away, at the moment, with what may be one of the biggest contricts in history, which is the idea that the reason we're in this crisis, the reason that the deficit is so big, is somehow the fault of the public sector and the fault of New Labour spending loads of money on public services when it was in power. And unfortunately, New Labour go along with that line. Ed Miliband, the new leader of the Labour Party, made his speech to the Labour Party conference and said, "We've spent a lot of money on public services and now the time has come, we all accept we've got to cut back." But it's rubbish. New Labour in government did not spend a lot of money on public services. Far from it, in fact. As all of you who have lived through it will know, they got rid of free education. They introduced tuition fees. It was one of the first things they did back in 1997. People talk about benefit claimants being scroungers. In Britain, job seekers' allowance is £64 a week, which is the lowest of any country in Western Europe. If it had gone up with inflation from when the Tories were last in power, it would now be over £100 a week. So in other words, New Labour held down benefits for the unemployed. They didn't increase them in the time that they were in power. There are 5 million people in Britain who want social housing because the property bubble has burst and they know they're never going to be able to afford a deposit to get their own mortgage. But they can't get social housing because New Labour sold off 2 million council houses, even more than were sold off under the previous Tory government. There was more spending on the National Health Service. There's no question about that. But even that was linked to privatisation and to selling off the National Health Service, which, if you like, New Labour did gradually, and the Tories are now accelerating dramatically. The facts of the matter are that throughout New Labour's time in office, the public sector remained a smaller percentage of the economy, at about 40%, than in most other countries of Western Europe. In France, for example, it was 53% during the same period. In 2008, the public sector jumped to 46% of the economy. But that wasn't because New Labour spent more money on public services. That's because they spent £100 billion bailing out the finance sector when it went into crisis. That's why the deficit went up. This is a crisis of the private, not the public sector. And yes, this huge contract has been carried out, where those debts have been nationalised, have been handed over to the state balance sheet, and now the very financiers who got into those debts are demanding that we accept public services cuts in order to pay for them. But that kind of lie is paper thin, really. And as struggle develops against the cuts, it will very quickly become unsustainable. You can already see that, actually, even with what's taken place over the last month. So, when Mervyn King was invited to speak to the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, a month or so ago, which in our opinion he shouldn't have been invited, but he was invited to speak, he was forced onto the back foot. He had to say, we know it's not your fault, we know it's not your members' fault, we know it's the bankers' fault. The same with, what's his name, Cable's speech at the Liberal Democrat conference, where he had to make a few remarks about attacking the bankers, attacking free market capitalism and so on. But of course, they're forced back. They can't sustain the lie that it's our fault. But that doesn't alter the fact that they are absolutely determined to make sure that it's us that pays for the crisis. So corporation tax is going to be cut under this government to the lowest in the Western world, 23%, at the same time as our public services are going to be absolutely slashed. How are we going to stop the cuts? Our answer in the first place is to say, this is not our crisis, it's not of our making, and we will not pay for it. We do not accept a single cut in public services, a single job loss, a single redundancy or cut in pensions. We're not saying there's nothing in the public sector that could be cut. They want to scrap Trident? Great. They want to withdraw the troops from Afghanistan that we've been campaigning for years? Great. But we don't accept a single cut in public services. And it's a lesson of the poll tax that this movement can only succeed if we are united. If we go down the road of saying, as students for example, we want to defend our education and we accept our lecturers getting less money in order to defend our education, if we allow ourselves to be split young against old, public sector workers against people who use public services, if we say, as I heard my local Labour MP do, I'm all in favour of saving this accident and emergency, but the one down the road can shut. If we go down that road, this movement is doomed to defeat. We have to be united, saying we oppose all cuts in services. We defend every single job, and we want to bring together the workers in the services and the population that use them. And it was the same in Liverpool. I mean, I'll say more about Liverpool later on. But as you saw from the little clip there, we campaigned and fought successfully to build houses, to improve services, but we never supported the idea of increasing the rates, that was the equivalent of the council tax then, in order to do that. So we didn't allow the movement to be divided between those people who were most worried about paying more rates and those that were most worried about improving public services. We united both together and fought on both issues.